The 2025 Dobropilya Offensive is one of the clearest cases in the entire war of the Russian advance planned not for military goals, but for political ones, specifically for the Anchorage Summit on August 15, 2025. To make Russia look like it's winning right before the meeting, the command launched an offensive that, in purely military terms, was never going to hold the ground it took, and Russian troops would end up paying for it with thousands of lives. This kind of political layering is nothing new, and it's not unique to Russia. As we already discussed, the war in Ukraine is by nature a multidimensional conflict, where both sides try to gain support from abroad, while cutting off the support the enemy receives. This means that almost every major operation in this war has political dimension layered on top of the military one, and critics often raise this point against Ukrainian operations like the Kursk offensive. The Dobropilya offensive shows the same logic, running in the opposite direction, just at a much higher cost and even less impact. Since we are making quite a significant jump from our last video, where we covered the Donbass battlefield up to March 2025, we have to do a quick recap of what happened between this time and August 1st, 2025. At this point, Russian Grouping of Forces Center, numbering over 100,000 men, had spent more than 8 months trying to outflank Pokrovsk from the south, longer than the entire battle for Bakhmut. Over spring and summer, the advance there halted almost completely, despite the grouping's new head, Colonel General Valery Solochuk, who had replaced Andrei Mordvichov on May 15th, having committed the entire 2nd Combined Arms Army to this sector. The pincer from the north, however, formed faster and more recently, as the Russians continued their costly, but, in the light of Ukrainian infantry deficit, effective infiltration tactics. The summer foliage, which concealed hundreds of small infantry groups inside the kill zone from Ukrainian drones, was another significant advantage that enabled a slow and grinding offensive starting in May 2025. By August, the Russians had driven a substantial wedge between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. The concentrated effort of the entire 8th and 51st Combined Arms armies had paid off. The Ukrainians, with 3 times fewer men in this sector, and mostly stuck in 2-man positions resupplied only by drones due to the active work of Russian FPVs against logistics, were also in the midst of major military reform started in November 2024. The old system of groupings was being ditched in favor of the core system, meant to impose more permanent unit composition and replacement to eliminate unit fragmentation. It was a task of uttermost complexity. The 7th Rapid Response Corps, for example, commanded by Yevhen Lasichuk and formed over the summer specifically for the defense of Pokrovsk, had only one of its officially assigned brigades, the 25th Airborne, in its area of responsibility, with the rest of the units still only temporarily attached to it. With the Ukrainians trying to maintain at least some logistics into Pokrovsk and constantly repelling Russian assaults there, as well as near Rodinske, a gap to the northeast begins to materialize. The Russians quickly located, and with reinforcements flowing freely, they concentrate a major one-way attack force there. With the actual goal of the grouping still being the capture of Pokrovsk, this new offensive pointing to the opposite direction is by many accounts entirely, or at least partially, designed to demonstrate that Russia is capable of advancing fast before the swiftly arranged Anchorage Summit, where the presidents of Russia and the United States will meet for the first time in years, with Vladimir Putin defying the international isolation he has been in since 2022. From August 1st through August 10th, active infiltration begins on the northern pincer, together with intensification of OMPK glide bomb strikes, with the Russians sending more and more 2-man teams and occasionally slightly larger groups to bypass the thin line of Ukrainian observation posts. They barely use any armor, relying instead on weather, anti-thermal blankets, and night movement to minimize the chances of being spotted by drones. Eventually, by August 11th, this produces a snowball effect. A substantial and no longer concealable thousands of Russians dispersed between and behind Ukrainian lines, infiltrating up to the village of Zoloty Kolodez. Some groups even reached the Dobropilya-Kramatorsk road, which just days earlier had been one of the safe and active supply routes of the town of Dobropilya itself. In 11 days, the Russians near Pokrovsk achieved their fastest advance since May 2024, forming a salient of roughly 15 by 6 kilometers, with barely any armored vehicles involved. The strategic group in Dnipro command initially downplayed the adversary's success, but reality quickly caught up, especially as evidence of infiltration in a dozen or so villages near Dobropilya mounted. The Russians were actively using dedicated soldiers, whose only purpose was to plant a flag and snap a photo to broadcast every minor success as quickly as possible. another piece of evidence pointing to the absence of operational secrecy and the largely politically motivated nature of offensive. But it did not automatically make the operation a failure. By August 12th, the Russians also leveraged the command shock to infiltrate around Pokrovsk and Rodinske, significantly extending the gray zone there. At the first glance, the situation looks like a significant frontline collapse. But little did anyone know that the initial shock of the Ukrainian command had already given way to clear vision of what to do. The single most consequential decision became public that evening. The 1st Azov Corps of the National Guard, commanded by hero of Ukraine Denis Redis Prokopenko, without exaggeration a legendary figure since the defense of Mariupol, was redeployed to the Dobropillia area. The newly formed Corps' Chief of Staff, Lieutenant Colonel Arsen Lemko Dmitrik, already reacting to the breakthrough, gathered the command of the multiple reinforcements pulled from different parts of the front line to work together on the mitigation of the breach. Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky had already committed elements of the 79th and 82nd Air Assault Brigades, the 25th Airborne Brigade, the 32nd, 33rd and 93rd Mechanized Brigades, the 1st and 425th Skala Assault Regiments, the 1st Black Swan Assault Battalion, the 38th Marine Brigade, the 92nd Assault Brigade, and the 414th Birds of Magyar UAV Brigade. Over 100 officers were now gathered in the Azov Corps Command Center, each responsible for tiny fractions of the above-mentioned units, but all under a single unified command, determined to cut the salient to pieces. While the Russian advance was rapid, it was logistically uncalculated, and as a result, it was impossible to turn it into operational-level breakthrough without significant reinforcements. The troops sent into those small infantry groups were essentially treated as disposable, with some receiving minimal supplies by drones, but in essence, they had already completed their key mission, taking photos of newly captured positions and getting into global media headlines. Their fate after that was no longer a concern of the Russian grouping of forces center. This, together with new Ukrainian command structure and reinforcements in this sector, quickly results in the isolation of Kucherev Yar, together with elements of the Russian 5th, 110th and 132nd Motor Rifle Brigades, by August 15th. Elements of the 92nd Assault Brigade and other units also secured the key highway to Dobropillia, as well as Zoloty Kolodez, restoring the critical logistical line. Elements of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade had cleared Ruske and Vasile, notably relying not only on infantry, but also on land drones with machine guns, another relatively recent innovation that quickly becomes a norm. The active use of tanks also hints that Russians have minimal drone coverage in the area, which allows Ukrainians to counterattack quite safely and also recapture Nikhanorivka, threatening the very base of the salient. In other words, the process of cutting the bulge to pieces had begun. The process, however, is not fast. Russian infiltrators received no order to retreat or attempt to break out of the encirclements. Instead, they apparently were instructed to further dissipate across the area, which makes Ukrainian search and destroy missions extremely complex, even with involvement of drones. Every half-destroyed basement or tree line has to be meticulously checked by assault troops before it can be declared cleared. That's why showing specific front lines without large gray zones here is practically impossible. At the same time, dozens out of hundreds of atomized and encircled Russian groups quickly understand that they are on their own and surrender. The bulk of forces, however, continue to resist or hide to survive behind enemy lines. By the end of the month, however, the gray zones are reduced significantly around Pokrovsk, signifying not a complete halt of infiltration into the city, but rather a number of quite effective counter-infiltration operations, especially from Syrsky's dedicated assault units. The 425th Separate Assault Regiment Skala, for example, raised the Ukrainian flag in Novoekonomichne on August 31st after a 2-week street-by-street operation, then advanced near Udachne on September 1st. Russians also start using vehicle columns against Ukrainians in Vernograd, but without much success. The Anchorage Summit on August 15, 2025 turned out to be short and largely without substance. Yet, Putin walked away with exactly what he had come for: a PR tour breaking his international isolation, and tentative understanding that the US would scale back support for Ukraine and indefinitely postpone additional sanctions, all in exchange for a vague negotiation track. On the front line by the end of August, Russian command had managed to redeploy significant reinforcements after the failed Sumo offensive to the Pokrovsk and Dobropillia axis. The 40th, 155th, and 336th Marine Brigades, the 177th Marine Regiment, as well as the 11th Air Assault Brigade and the 76th Air Assault Division. Most of those troops were in quiet rock state after heavy combat in the Kursk region, which once again highlights how this operation prevented such a major reserve redeployment from happening earlier and possibly exploiting the original Dobropillia breakthrough. Moreover, they are commanded by, without a doubt, a legendary figure, Sohrab Akhmedov, under whose leadership Russian Marines were sent into mostly useless and extremely bloody assaults near Vuhledar and in the Kursk region. By September 10th, Ukrainian forces continued to methodically reduce the Russian salient, moving quite slowly but trying to minimize losses in assaults, as well as not letting any Russians stay behind their positions. As we already mentioned, no longer interested in expanding what had looked like a breakthrough, the Russians shift their focus back to Pokrovsk. Ukrainians at the same time see the Dobropillia axis as more critical. Around September 12th, Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky visits the 1st Corps Azov headquarters in this direction, where he meets with Denis Prokopenko and Oleg Apostol, head of the air assault forces. He also dispatches additional reinforcements, mirroring the Russian move to redeploy units from the deprioritized and now largely frozen Sumy direction. It's also worth mentioning that the Russians, at exactly this time, committed 336th Marine Brigade to try to break through to the encircled units. The rest of the Marines, with certain minor successes, are concentrated to the east of Shahove. This village is a key Russian tactical objective here, since capturing it would allow them to link up with the hundreds of Russians trapped in tight pockets and potentially revitalize the advance towards Dobropillia. The heavy concentration of airstrikes on Shahove, as well as the fact that this is precisely where the Ukrainian reinforcements from Sumy were redeployed, only confirms its importance. That said, Shahove is a tactical goal. The operational one, after the failure to infiltrate into Dobropillia, still remains Pokrovsk. In this video, we will only touch on events around the city itself tangentially, but it's worth noting that Pokrovsk, significantly cut off from logistics, continues to be under constant pressure. Using their numerical advantage, the Russians push from all directions with their small infantry groups, and by September 20th, they slip through to make a foothold on the very southern outskirts. With the pressure on Novoekonomichna also yielding certain gains, at this point we can definitely say that the battle for Pokrovsk itself has begun. By the end of the month, the Russians managed to retake only Udachne, which had already changed hands multiple times, and still struggled to close the encirclement. They have, however, already established fire control over the road in and out of Pokrovsk with drones, especially since the redeployment of the elite Rubicon UAV unit from Kursk, now reaching over 20 kilometers behind the front line and becoming the main tool severing Ukrainian logistics. Around Dobropillia salient, by October 1st, Ukrainian counteroffensive action results in another grouping of Russians being cut off thanks to the coinciding strikes from Pankivka and Nikhanorivka. A significant area to the west of Kucherev Yar is also recaptured. Together with Novaya Shahove, the Russians actively tried to counterattack there, as well as push to capture Rodinske on October 10th, a battle for which had already been raging for over 2 months. The largest attack, however, is launched against Shahove, as Sohrab Akhmedov, in his signature maneuver, commits the carefully accumulated armor reserves for the first real mechanized breakthrough attempt on this axis in months. The plan is straightforward. The assault opens with several dozen motorcycles, split into 2 columns, one bypassing Volodymyrivka towards Shahove, the other striking Volodymyrivka from the south, followed by the armor in successive waves. But the northern column stalls at the destroyed bridge over the Kazanny Torets river, turns back and joins the southern one inside Volodymyrivka. The throughput of one bridge, likely damaged, is not enough, so this is where the plan collapses. 33rd Assault Regiment is also dug in along the southern flank, and the Russian armored vehicles packed in the kill zone and observed from multiple drones start receiving fire from everything in Ukrainian disposal. Drones, artillery, and HIMARS jammel rest strikes annihilate 16 pieces of armor and infantry completely, thwarting the assault. By October 12th, it also becomes clear that hundreds of Russians in the pockets, undersupplied for over 2 months, start to crumble under Ukrainian pressure. By October 21st, the Ukrainians clear even more territory, but the Russians also push into Pokrovsk itself, leveraging seasonal weather effects such as rain and fog that make drones less effective. Without this key advantage, Ukrainians, who used to kill most infiltrators before they reached the city just months ago, basically have no chance to see them all, and a dangerous accumulation of Russians in the buildings begins. To address right away The idea that the Dobropilya Offensive was some kind of a genius diversionary move. It's worth noting that the key troops defending Pokrovsk remained more or less in place throughout it. If the Dobropilya Offensive had truly been planned as a diversion, it would have made far more sense to launch it now, with Marines forming second echelon instead of sunny and dry August, in open fields easily seen by drones. But the Anchorage Summit changed the plans. The Russians do not really need much in the way of diversions. They had already raised their grouping size to as much as 170,000 troops just against Pokrovsk and Dobropilya. For reference, this is equivalent of the entire land forces of Germany and France combined. So, the city's fate is largely decided, but it does not mean that the Ukrainians will not prolong the fighting just to squeeze as many Russian casualties as possible out of this battle, just like with every other Donbas city lost under Russia's relentless pressure. You can take it with a pinch of salt, but according to the leaked Russian documents, the center grouping suffered 43,709 killed, missing or captured, and another 52,865 wounded in the first 8 months of 2025, roughly 34% of all Russian casualties across the entire front. The 2nd Combined Arms Army alone lost 15,310 as killed and wounded, the 51st Combined Arms Army around 13,000. In other words, the Russians lost more men in this single sector than the entire size of the Ukrainian grouping they claim to have encircled, because when Russian Ministry of Defense boasted of trapping 31 Ukrainian battalions in Pokrovsk, that figure, by any reasonable count, cannot translate to more than 30,000 troops. By October 22nd, the Ukrainian 132nd Reconnaissance Battalion, the brigades Kucherev's Yar, taking over 50 POWs, while by the 25th, forces of the 82nd Air Assault Brigade clear a significant swath of land, relieving pressure on Rodinske from the north. By October 27th, the only Russian pocket left in place of the salient towards Dobropilya is further cut in two. At the same time, the Russians keep launching assaults against Shakhove every few days, mostly from the east and with large armored columns. After several of these managed to deliver infantry into the village despite heavy losses, the 1st Corps Azov shifts its approach. Deep remote mining is extended dozens of kilometers back along the Russian approach routes, targeting the armor long before it can reach the forward positions. This sharply reduces the success rate of the armored columns, which at peak numbered 20 to 30 vehicles, and inflicts losses so heavy on Russian Marines that they once again begin to quietly disappear from Frontline. In essence, Azov mirrors here what the Russians are doing on the roads in and out of Pokrovsk, imposing a kill zone on the key axis of advance and supply routes. On the Pokrovsk axis, by October 29th, the Russians, further leveraging the worsening weather for drones, try to get as much infantry as possible into the collapsing city, half of which is by now basically a grey zone. Using light vehicles such as civilian cars and motorcycles, as well as dressing up as civilians. At the same time, Vladimir Putin publicly claims that the city is fully encircled and offers a 2 to 6 hour micro ceasefire to allow journalists in. All of this, despite having absolutely no military sense, also demonstrates a new, quite delusional trend: the Russian higher military command taking land on credit. To keep up with the appetites of the political leadership, Russian officers at every level are essentially fabricating and overestimating their successes, to the point where reports at the top do not just diverge from reality. They form a reality of their own, where all grey zone is already Russian, and cities where there are no Russians or only a single pair with a flag are automatically painted as fully captured. This trend will reach its peak when we will discuss the similar Kupiansk offensive and the Ukrainian counterattack there. Meanwhile, by November 4th, one of the smaller pockets is fully cleared by the Ukrainians as well. Inside Pokrovsk, by November 11th, the Ukrainians have lost around 60% of the city, continuing stubborn resistance in the northern outskirts to maintain a supply line to Bernograd, itself close to encirclement, with the 38th Marine Brigade and auxiliary units inside, but surprisingly holding longer despite predictions it would fall first. By November 20th, the Russians have certain successes near Volodymyrivka, but they still cannot push through to the tiny encircled garrison behind Ukrainian lines, despite the heavy losses the Marines took in those attacks. Finally, by November 29th, the Ukrainian Dobropilya counteroffensive officially ends, per announcement of the Lieutenant General Oleg Apostol, commander of the Ukrainian Air Assault Forces, who had also taken an active part in the planning of the operation. The Russian Dobropilya offensive itself concluded in status quo antebellum. Every initially captured settlement was back in Ukrainian hands, roughly 70 square kilometers had been recaptured, and a few hundred more cleared of sporadic infiltrators. It is estimated that the Russians lost around 12,000 troops in this specific operation alone, a tactical defeat that paradoxically still achieved its political purpose. The breakthrough sold itself at Anchorage had lines exactly as intended, and the disposable infantry groups that paid the price had already done their job by the time the Azov Corps arrived to fully grind them down. Yet, 12,000 men is just a drop in the ocean compared to over 100,000 casualties the Russians suffered around Pokrovsk since the beginning of the year. Losses they have nonetheless managed to effectively compensate for through continued recruitment. Ukrainians, by contrast, cannot replace their men so fast, and this asymmetry, more than any single tactical failure, is what eventually forces the Ukrainian command to initiate a fighting withdrawal from Pokrovsk and Myrnograd, with only some northern positions still held at the end of November 2025. By the time of this withdrawal, both cities have long ceased to function as logistical hubs. The railway is gone, the Pokrovsk-Konstantinivka highway is a graveyard of burnt vehicles, and the final supplies are being delivered on foot across open fields between Pokrovsk and Rodinska. What Russia is about to capture is again complete ruins. The Pyrrhic victory pattern that has defined every major Donbass city to fall since Severodonetsk. The situation in the Pokrovsk axis, just like in previous major breakthroughs, was defined by several factors that increasingly look less like local circumstances and more like a permanent template of the war on the Donbass. First of all, once again the autumn weather, fog, low cloud and persistent rain, making drones less effective, allowed the Russians to speed up infiltration, capturing 464 square kilometers in August, 259 in September, 267 in October, and sharp jump to 505 in November, most of it on the front line we just discussed. A similar pattern, even though more extreme, emerged in 2024. This seasonality is now built into Russian planning. Winters and early springs, when there is the least cover for infiltration, are used to prepare. Green summers and foggy autumns are when they actually move. The asymmetry here is critical. The Ukrainians depend on drones to actually find and destroy the small infiltration groups that observation posts can only spot, while the Russians use their drones against clearly defined targets, the supply routes that Ukrainian troops cannot relocate or hide much. When the weather grounds both sides' drones, it's the Ukrainians who lose the ability to strike infiltrators, while the Russians simply have to wait out the cloud cover before resuming their fire control over the same fixed Ukrainian logistics that they have been hammering all year. The second factor is the Ukrainian shortage of infantry, with a few troops available scattered along observation posts and increasingly intermixed with Russian infiltration groups inside the kill zone, a 15 to 25 kilometer deep belt where the millions of aerial and ground drones now produced annually by both sides do everything from reconnaissance and resupply to evacuation and precision strikes. Fiber optic FPVs, immune to electronic warfare and to a lesser extent radio-controlled drones, are what defines this belt and makes the Allied movement or vehicles essentially suicidal. And third, the small group infiltration doctrine that made the Dobropillia breach possible has spread by the end of November to most of the front line. Kupiansk, Liman, Gulay-Pole, moving forward a few kilometers here and there, slowly but steadily eating into Ukrainian positions without using armor. We have already covered the mechanics of this template in previous videos, so it's enough to note that Ukraine's bet to break it is now twofold. New defensive lines are being built much deeper and more continuous than before, this time tuned against infantry rather than vehicles. The unfortunate part is that the most developed of these lines sit behind Pokrovsk, and the other large towns currently being lost, meaning the loss of Pokrovsk itself, painful as it is not a catastrophe, especially after over a year of assaults. It is the moment Ukrainian troops just fall back onto ground they have spent months preparing. In parallel, the drone war is being pushed further in Russian-controlled territory, extending the kill zone over roads, supply hubs and assembly areas, so that the snowball can be broken up before it even forms. Combined with the exponential growth of unmanned ground vehicles, which by 2026 can potentially take over most of the resupply and casualty evacuation, this is what will define the next year of the war.